Be quiet for a second.
Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history and the authors that have written about them. In April 2006, a 12-year-old girl named J.R. committed a brutal crime that terrified parents everywhere. After weeks of plotting, she and her 23-year-old boyfriend stabbed to death her mother, father, and little brother in the family's home in Medicine Hat, Alberta, making her the youngest multiple killer in Canadian history. J.R. was a quiet honor roll student living in the small prairie town of Medicine Hat, Alberta, but her middle-class existence concealed an ominous alter ego, Runaway Devil. Her internet persona professed a fondness for a darker world of death metal music, goth subculture, and her love for the much older Jeremy Stenke, a high school dropout living in a trailer park with his mother. When J.R. got involved with Jeremy, her concerned parents tried all the tough love strategies to restrain her and interrupt the relationship, to no avail. Was J.R. simply growing up too fast and under the spell of a Swangali like Stenke, or was she really the puppet master who manipulated her boyfriend to do her bidding? Based on the trials and exclusive interviews with the prosecutors, police, family, and friends of the victim and murderers, Runaway Devil, Forbidden Love, Lycanthropy, Death Metal, and Murder, how Forbidden Love drove a 12-year-old to murder her family, Runaway Devil, with my special guests this evening, Robert Remington and Sherry Zigfoos. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview. Robert Remington, thank you very much for agreeing to this program.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having us.
Yes, what is the status of Sherry? Is she going to call in as well?
I believe she was scheduled to. I know that she was in on the West Coast, so I don't know. I haven't seen her all day. I'm sorry, and I got tied up in traffic. Sorry, I'm late.
Oh, no problem. No problem at all. Well, let's start off until she does connect, and we'll get her right on air and introduce her and get her to answer some questions as well. Let me ask you personally, Robert, how did you become involved in this case, and why did you personally decide to write a book about this murder trial?
Well, we got involved in the case when the story broke down in Medicine Hat, and we had a report that 3 people were dead in a house, and Sherry was the first one to go down. We at first thought it was what we in the business call a domestic case, a murder-suicide, distraught father, whatever, and so she went down there first, and then immediately had found out that there was something bigger going on, that this 12-year-old girl was missing, that the police were looking for her, and it just every day, it just got deeper and deeper and more complex and more fascinating for us, and the reason we decided to write a book on it was, it wasn't until more than a year later, it was during her trial, and we realized that this was a significant case. This was going to be the youngest person ever convicted of multiple homicide in Canada, and we decided, somebody's going to be doing a book on it, and might as well be us, because we happen to know more about it than anyone else, especially myself. Unknown to me at the time of the murder, but I found out during the trial that a friend of mine was also a friend of the victims, and so we had all these connections and all this information, and we decided to go ahead with the book.
That's great. Now, the story is set in a place called Medicine Hat for our American friends here in our audience, and for people that don't know, in Medicine Hat, Alberta. Where is this located in relation to, say, a city we might know, Calgary, Alberta? And what is the size of the city? What is the community known for? What are the people like there, really?
Medicine Hat is a prairie city southeast of Calgary, about 3 hours, sort of near the Saskatchewan border. It's I guess about 30, 40 minutes from the Saskatchewan border. It's a very fascinating place. It's very, very hot, arid, dry summers. It has actually cactus that blooms there, small yellow cactuses, deep coulees, carved by the sort of wind and rain out of the prairie. And nearby is a World Heritage Site called Dinosaur Provincial Park. There's a lot of hoodoos, so it has a very rich sort of descriptive quality about it. It is known primarily, it sits on top of the largest or one of the largest natural gas fields in North America. Rudyard Kipling had visited this area in the early 1900s, and he wrote that he saw all these flaming, gas flares and everything, and he wrote that that the area had all hell for a basement. And because of all it was this Dante-like kind of infernos that were sort of driving the area. It actually had at one time it had gas-fired streetlights on this prairie city, and they actually just kept them burning because gas was so cheap. It was cheaper to let them burn than to pay, civic employees to go around and put them out. And today, the city is about 60,000 people. It's oil and gas, it's ranching, there's a nearby military base, Canadian Forces base, that also a lot of British troops train there. It's also near in Saskatchewan, on the Saskatchewan-Alberta border, there's a place called Cypress Hills Provincial Park. It's the only place in this section of North America that was untouched by the Ice Age. So you have this dry, flat area, and then these hills that are very lush and high and green and pine trees. I'm sorry. So it's got this rich tapestry. It's actually quite a fascinating place. A lot of old brick buildings downtown along the river valley, the South Saskatchewan River, and there's big, huge dogwood trees that grow there. And it has a lot of these brick buildings because it had a brick yard that was. They had a rich deposit of clay, and they had this abundance of natural gas, so they were able to fire the clay and build these bricks for all the prairie cities and across the emerging West. And so it's got these old kind of brick buildings downtown. It's kind of a neat town.
So it's got a rich, like you say, a rich tapestry, but a rich history, and as well, the certain affluence. Anyway, there's a certain success to the city itself. It's not mired in poverty as much. It's mainly I would say working class, upper, middle working class people, as could be expected in a resource town, natural gas town. But there's also, like any community, doctors, lawyers, Sure.
small. It is somewhat isolated because it's 3.5 hours from the nearest big city, which is Calgary, and
certainly,
and then and then beyond that you get you go to Regina, Saskatchewan, and so it's out there, as another author who wrote the book In True Blood described the town of Holcomb, Kansas, where that murder occurred.
Right. Let's get to the subject of the book, or one of the subjects of the book, and that is a woman named J.R. Obviously, can't use her real name because of her age, especially here.
We're restricted in Canada by the Youth Criminal Justice Act. We can't name her. That's correct.
Right. One of the subjects of the Runaway Devil is a girl named J.R., like I said, and I'd like to know, who were her parents? What were her parents like? What was their backgrounds, and what was J.R.'s early family life growing up?
Well, one of the odd things about this case is that we really don't know a lot about her years growing up, because the people who can tell us are all dead. Her mother, her father, her little brother, they were all murdered by J.R. and her accomplice. So we can only garner, secondhand and through my friend, who was a friend of the family. The mom and dad met in Ontario. They were both from or near an area, town called Sudbury, Ontario, and they had met there, and they moved to Alberta to in the early 2000s, there was huge boom going on in Alberta, largest supplier of oil, or largest supply of oil in Alberta outside of Saudi Arabia, and big oil boom going on. So Alberta at the time was a magnet for people from other places, and they were drawn to Alberta. They first lived in a little town south of Calgary called Okotoks, and her dad, JR's dad, Mark, worked for a large gas company called Encana, and they had a rough patch in their lives. Both of them had been through counseling for substance abuse, but they were clean when they got married, and they were, I guess they were drawn together because they both had these backgrounds, and they had really overcome sort of those problems in their past, and they vowed to each other that they were going to live a clean life, and they were going to be model parents, and they were going to raise their children as model parents, and they were actually an inspiration to others. A friend of mine met JR's mother, Deborah, through Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, and Deborah was kind of a mentor and a real inspiration to a lot of people who were struggling, and she really worked hard to help people get off substance abuse issues. As far as we know, there was never any substance abuse in the home. There was never, as far as we know, no alcohol use. They were described actually by friends and family and neighbors in this little town called Okotoks as a Norman Rockwell family. And JR was a kind of they went to a church, and they were in school. JR was a very smart girl. Her little brother Jacob was born in this town called Okotoks, and then Mark really worked hard, and he bettered himself. He took a lot of classes, and he got a job as an instrument technician at a gas plant near Medicine Hat, and he was, by all accounts, a very diligent guy who was good with machines and tools, and was a problem solver, and he was a real asset to the people he worked with and to the operation of this key gas plant that was about 45 minutes outside of Medicine Hat. And they felt when they moved to Medicine Hat that they had really arrived. They had overcome a lot of struggles in life. They bought their first home together in this subdivision, and kind of working middle class people in the area. And JR was, going to school. She was a very bright, smart student. She was on the swim club. She was an A student, honor roll student, went to a Catholic girls' school. And, things were going along well. And then things kind of went off the rails when she, kind of the last half of the 6th grade for her, she started to go sideways.
And how old was she at that time?
She was 11 and a half. And she was very mature for her age. When the
physically,
pardon me, physically,
physically,
yeah. Physically very mature. When the crime occurred in the spring of 2006, she was 12 and a half years old, and she did not look like 12. She could easily pass for 16. She was physically mature. But just to back up a bit, at about age 11 and a half, grade 6, her and a few other girls at their school, they started getting into sort of darker music and darker clothing and goth lifestyle. And it was a Catholic school, very conservative, and some of the other kids, just were then not making fun of them, but they were sort of the outcasts, as one described. They were the dark group, and the sort of goth, these little goth kids. and dressed in black and that sort of thing. But things weren't, too bad. And it was when she came back to school in seventh grade. That's when the counselors and the teachers started noticing, a real darker persona to her, dark clothing, short skirts, fishnet stockings, dark black lipstick, makeup, tears coming down, from her eyes and makeup, things like this. And in that summer between the 6th grade and the 7th grade, she had discovered social networking websites, and she started posting profiles of herself on a number of different sites, including one called Vampire Freaks, which is an industrial sort of goth website, kind of the Facebook of the goth industrial metal crowd, and she met. It was at that time that she started meeting some older males in the goth community in Medicine Hat, and it was odd when I went down there to cover this case. I drove into town, and here's this conservative prairie city, oil and gas workers, ranchers, cowboys, military guys,
right.
And I could spot right away there was these kids, these goth kids that I could see, and they stood out. They really stood out in this community, and I to me it was almost a throwback. I went, geez, I haven't seen any goth kids walking around for a long time, and she was hanging around a mall, typical mall in a typical city, and it was there that she'd started to meet a couple of older guys from the goth community, a guy by the name of Raven. He was really into the scene, and another guy by the name of Trenchcoat, and they were 18, 19, that age. She was 12, but to them she was more like 16. She never divulged her age. She was like 15. Girls tend to mature earlier than boys,
right.
Anyway, and I'm sure that she thought that the boys her age were geeky and everything else, and on and on and on. So she started meeting these older males. And they started calling, and her parents then were getting concerned. I mean, their daughter was 12 years old, and she was hanging out with these guys who were 17 and 18, and so they had some concerns about it. And then the school had concerns because, she was sort of going through this rebellious stage and everything. But, what was kind of interesting about her is, very smart, very intelligent, highly developed, and I think she was, went through this natural rebelliousness, but she was also drawn to the artistic side of the goth culture, the music, the poetry, that sort of brooding aspect to it. There's a very artistic side to the goth culture, and
sure.
And she just kind of got into that, and then lo and behold, one of the guys who sort of was on the periphery of the scene and coming into it was a guy by the name of Jeremy Allen Steinke. He was 21 years old, and he identified with the goth subculture as well because he came from the wrong side of the tracks. His mother was an alcoholic. He had there was a lot of abuse in his home, and the goth community can be very accepting, non-judgmental. And and he was an outcast in his life. He was bullied, and people made fun of his last name. His last name was Stanky, and the kids called him Stinky. And they were, he had a rough upbringing, rough life, and all of a sudden, he found this goth community that accepted him, and he also started posting profiles on Vampire Freaks and a couple other sites, and the thing about social networking websites is you can be anybody you want. You can, she pretended to be much older than she was. She had this kind of vixen-like image, and she presented herself as being, I think, 15, and Jeremy was also presenting himself. Oh, and sorry, she had one of her online names was Runaway Devil. And Jeremy called himself soul eater, and so they had these personas online, and with Jeremy, for the first time in his life, he could actually be somebody. He was this goth, guy that, and he found acceptance, and he was a kind of a crazy, wild, everybody described him as outgoing and vivacious, and he posted on his site, and he bragged to people that he was a 300-year-old werewolf. He was part of a Lycan brotherhood, and then they both wrote brooding poetry. So here was this guy, 21 years old, from the wrong side of the tracks, meets J.R., middle-class, smart, honor roll student, at the mall, and she's a middle-class kid, and they sort of met, and Jeremy was sort of this. Everybody kind of looked up to him. He would do anything for anybody, and he would give them a shirt off their back, and he was this gregarious, kind of outgoing. And she was introduced to him by another girl in that scene, and Jeremy had a green Firebird, and they went out in the parking lot, and they did not wheelies, donuts they call them, in the parking lot and that sort of thing, and they kind of laughed and hung out, and slowly they just started getting closer together. And when this story broke, we were describing them as in a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, and people would write to us and say, "How can you say that? The guy's a pedophile. She's 12. He's 21. How can they be boyfriend-girlfriend?" And what people don't understand is that Jeremy was more like a 15-year-old. He had the intellectual and physical maturity, and he was just immature. He was like a 15-year-old kid, and J.R. was like a 15 or 16-year-old kid, because she was physically mature, she was advanced, she was smart, and they sort of met in the middle, and it was like fire and gasoline coming together, and her parents, didn't like the older guys she was hanging out with.
Let me interrupt you for a second, Robert.
Yeah.
I want to go back just a little bit, because I think it's really important as well. Is that we've already have them meet, and you've explained that they're both. She's a few years more mature than she should be for her age, and he is far less mature than his age, so it works out pretty good. And I agree with you definitely on that. Let's go back a little bit, though, to when there was the clothing infractions at school, and when she was sneaking out to go to punk concerts, and when her behavior changed, like you said, at the end of grade 6 and then into grade 7.
Right.
Part of this story is, though, that her parents, you describe them as people that formerly had a little bit of trouble in their life, and I'm sure lots of those people try to overcompensate, like you say, and be really good parents and try to do everything they can for their kids and provide for them and try to prevent them making any of the same kind of mistakes. Now, what did the parents do initially in that from grade 6 to grade 7? Because I think it's important later in how they respond to when they find out about Jeremy Stenke and involvement with their daughter. But before that, what did the parents do with JR? How did they attempt to try to change her behavior? And tell us a little bit about that, because I think it's important to this story.
Well, her from one, if you look at it from one side of the equation, they were doing everything right. A lot of people say, be involved in with your kids, know who their friends are, ask questions, monitor their computer use, and do all those things. And they started doing all that. And they, JR had met, before she met Jeremy, there was a guy that she met who was 16, and her mom wanted to, because he was older, she was 12, he was 16. She wanted to meet him. They were trying to be good parents. She invited him over for tea. JR, this was the height of embarrassment for her, to have, this guy come over and have her mom grill him, in her opinion. But, she was just, trying to be a mom and trying to find out what the guy was about, and allowed them to go out. And he was kind of a clean-cut, normal, high school kid. And I think her mom was concerned about his age. And as far as we know from both JR and both him, they weren't intimate. they'd kind of hung out, but it didn't last very long, and it kind of broke off, and she started getting more attracted to these older guys. And so her mom and dad were, trying to, learn more about who she was hanging out with, and she really didn't want to tell them. And there's another aspect to parenting. We're in an age of, I think, of hyper-parenting, where there's moms and dads are called, helicopter moms, that they're too close to their kids, that they want to know, they want to be so involved in their kids that they're not letting have the freedoms that they want. Now, we don't really know if, Deborah was a helicopter mom. Was she being too overbearing, or was she just doing the things right? To JR, in JR's point of view, she wanted freedom. She thought, I'm grown up, I'm mature, what do you know, Mom? In fact, my friend, who was a friend of the family, said that, JR would, say things like that to her mom, and would say, what do you know? And you don't understand, typical stuff like that. And so they were doing those types of things, and they were, trying to find out more, and they were having troubles, and they actually agreed, and JR agreed to go to family counseling at one time. They decided they would all get together and try and, work some of these issues out. JR had been grounded at one time. Grounding to her parents was probably the right response, but it's very much a kind of a 1950s or 1960s approach. I mean, kids today with internet, and it's almost impossible to ground them. They were monitoring their computer use, but she would just go use the computers at school and communicate with some of these older guys and that sort of stuff. So they were doing those sorts of things, and then Jeremy came on the scene. And then the hammer really came down on her. They became quite strict.
Did they find out initially how old he really was, though? You could say whatever you want about maturity being matched, but the simple fact is their daughter's 12.
Exactly.
And this idiot is 21 or 22.
I don't think they knew his age. In fact, some of her friends, even didn't believe he was like 21. Some of her friends didn't like him.
But certainly knew there was a gap of 6 or 7 years there.
They knew there was a gap for sure, yeah. And and Jeremy, they had when she started going with Jeremy, and he was calling, and they weren't sure who the boys were that were calling, and they just knew that stuff was going wrong. And she was going to these punk shows on the weekend, and to their credit, they had grounded her at one time and said, no, you're going off the rails. And then they went to counseling, and then they agreed to let her go to one of these punk shows. They were held in community halls and goth metal bands and stuff like that. And they actually agreed to go with her to one of these shows just to find out what it was all about. And again, to JR, this would have been the height of embarrassment for her. But they weren't chaperoning. They just wanted to go and hang out. And they went with a couple of her friends and her, and they said okay. I mean, she was 12, and so it's
they're cool parents.
Yeah, it's not unreasonable for parents. I mean, they rode motorcycles. They were kind of cool parents, in one respect. So they went to this punk show with her, and they were just kind of walking around on the fringes, and she kind of disappeared, and then they ran into one of her friends, and they said, "Where's JR?" And they said, "Well, I don't know." And they said, "Well," so they decided to go look for her. They went out into the alley behind this community hall, and they saw her and Jeremy making out in the alleyway, but behind.
Incredible.
And Jeremy, you have to understand, Jeremy was a you have to describe. I have to describe what he looked like. He had kind of short spiked hair, gold, dark eyeliner, sort of blondish, spiky hair, short. He had dark eyeliner that he wore around his eyes. he always wore hoodies, black hoodies, fishnet stockings on his hand, wristbands, and he often wore a mask, a cold weather neoprene mask with the hoodie pulled up and all that. He was a fierce looking person, you know.
No eyebrows too, as well. I see from the photo.
I'm not sure about the eyebrows.
He's definitely, you've described.
There is a picture.
He's a very freaky looking, dangerous looking dude for sure.
He was a dangerous looking dude. I just have to refresh my memory of the gentleman. I'm just going to flip to pages. You know, and he wore these neckerchiefs as well around his. You know, so he was kind of a fierce looking dude, and the cops knew him quite well, and they stopped him. He had this Firebird and he'd tool around, and they had stopped him. He was driving down the street with his neoprene mask on over his face and his hoodie up in the middle of summer, and you know, and they're going, you know, and he would walk into a mall like that, and the mall security would come up to him and say, you know, hey buddy, you know, lose the face mask, you know, what are you up to, right? And so anyway, so they walk into the alleyway and they see their 12-year-old guy with this obvious, you know, older looking. He was either a man, but you know, he could have been maybe 18 or something to them, you know, and her mom and dad were really mad, and Jeremy took off one way down the alley, and her mom and dad grabbed JR. They took her home, and they were seething mad by now because they, you know, saw what was going on, and that's when the hammer came down. They grounded her. They this is according to JR. They took her computer away. They boxed it up. They, you know, took her music out of her room. I mean, according to her, they really, really cracked down and, you know, just really monitoring her and all that kind of stuff. And that's when she really started, you know, to lose it. And, you know, boxing up the computer was no obstacle for her because she would just go to the school, to the local library, and she would communicate with Jeremy online, and they started sending messages back and forth about how evil my parents are, and that's when they started talking about, you know, what to do with JR's mom and dad.
Now, you haven't talked too much about Jeremy Stenke, his situation. Where's his father in this situation? What's his mother like? The other situation is it just the music that she's drawn to, and Jeremy's involved with the music, the goth subculture here, or is there some drugs involved? And if there is, what kind of drugs are we talking about, and how serious are these guys in their involvement with drugs?
Jeremy was a pothead. You know, they drank. The alcohol, I think, was a bigger part of their scene. There are a lot of these kids that they hung out with. You know, and I should explain here. Jeremy wasn't really true goth, what you'd call true goth. You know, there was a girl we talked to who was an older, you know, young woman, who said, you know, goth isn't something that you just do to make your parents mad when you're 14. It's a lifestyle choice, and the goth subculture itself is, you know, is generally nonviolent, accepting. There's a lower rate of violence in the goth community than there is in the general community. It's very artistic. It's brooding. It's a look, you know, that sort of thing. It was goth came about as a backlash to the sort of you know early 80s boy band music and all that, you know, kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I actually found, you know, most of the goth kids, you know, to be, you know, pretty neat, you know, pretty interesting. You know, this guy like Raven, he was this brooding, artistic, you know, that sort of thing. But Jeremy, you know, it was his own version of goth. It was more of a violent, edgy, you know, and you know, people who are true goths, you know, really would say, you know, he's got nothing to do with the goth subculture lifestyle. He was just an angry, brooding, you know, young man. And the guys that he hung out with were, you know, they were alcoholics at, you know, 15, 16. They smoked a lot of pot. Jeremy had, you know, done some cocaine. You know, mainly they were big boozers. And getting into trouble and, you know, he had some, you know, petty crimes and, you know, bad checks and stuff like that, and some minor, you know, things with the law, but never anything real serious. But and you know, his music, they were into this death metal music, and a number of different bands, and it was very dark, and it was very, they kind of felt the world was against them. J.R. herself, I don't think that she did much drugs and alcohol. Jeremy, and Jeremy had come, if we could just talk about his background, in a way, our book is somewhat sympathetic to him, because you can understand where he was coming from. His mother was an alcoholic. His father, according to the testimony, his natural father was very abusive. His mother, there was violence in the home. His mother then, divorced, and she had a number of men that would come and go, and they were abusive as well. Jeremy describes being abused by several of his stepfathers, and got into a fight with one of them, and his mom moved around a lot, and they kind of lived what he described as the slums of Medicine Hat, down by the railroad tracks, and his mom was from a small town in Saskatchewan. She came to Alberta, and she was a hairdresser. She took beauty classes and things like that, and but she also had she has a terminal lung disease, right? And so his whole upbringing was just rough, and in a way you can understand what happened to him, because it was J.R. is a little harder to comprehend, because she came from the other side of the tracks. But the one thing as well, they had both gone through kind of breakups at the time when they got together. J.R. had gone with this, kind of wholesome 16-year-old, and that kind of went bad. And Jeremy had broken up with a girl as well, and so they came together at this time when they were both seeking something. And Jeremy, more than anything in the world, he wanted to be loved. He didn't have that at home. He didn't have it at school, and he found this, smart, pretty, young girl that he believed was 15 or 14. He thought she was legal, quote unquote, because in Canada at the time, 14 was a legal age of sexual consent. It's since been raised to 16, mercifully.
Yeah.
In my opinion, 14 was absurd.
Absolutely.
I mean, sex is a very powerful drug at that age.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jeremy met J.R., and all these things came together. And Stanky was, he was desperate to be loved. You could see that in his friends. He would do anything for his friends. He would drive through the night and pick them up, and he would drive them to some town 200 miles away to go to a punk show and stuff like that, and give people the shirt off their back, and on and on and on. But he had this edge to him, and he fantasized about being a member of the Lycan Brotherhood, this 300-year-old werewolf. And he met this one guy. And one time he told this guy, he says, "I wouldn't go for a walk by the river on the full moon." And the guy says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, we'll kill you and eat you." And it was stuff like that. Now it was a joke problem. Yeah, I mean,
he played the role anyway.
He played the role. I don't think he actually believed it. But.
Now let's get to the heart of this, because this is just incredible part of your book. It is the core of your book. It's just fascinating. How did this really, in your investigation, who started it? We know we'll say right now that he was bragging about what he could do, potentially what he could do. The whole goth scene, like you say, it's the artistic end of it, of people talking morbid conversations or dark poetry, the death metal. Nobody's taking this seriously and going out and murdering anybody, but they're listening to Cannibal Corpse and bands like this. So it's very serious music, but nobody takes it too serious. Right. Now, tell us what the correspondence was, how this started, what exactly was said, because that's what you do include in your book. What was really said by J.R. to Jeremy Stanky, and what did he say back? Give us that, please.
Well, you asked why we wrote the book. One of the reasons that we wrote the book is because even after she was convicted, there were people who said, "Oh, she was just a poor little lamb who was led astray by the big bad wolf."
Right.
And that's what I wanted to believe. I mean, she's 12. I desperately wanted to believe that she was just an innocent kid led astray. But when you start looking into it, it's clear that she was the mastermind, and she kept writing to Jeremy and saying, will you kill them? Will you kill my parents? We have to come up with a plan. And she had written one email and said, I have this plan. It begins with us killing them, and it ends up with me living with you. And they fantasized about running away to Germany and living in a castle. I mean, it was just ridiculous, right? And he wrote back and he said to her, "Well, I love your plan, but we have to get more creative and stuff." And it was kids today think the internet is this, I don't know what they think, but nothing on the internet is private. Your emails aren't private. Right. The computer forensics guys from the police department found all of these messages, reams of them, and she was writing back and forth and encouraging, and she kept saying, will you kill him? Are you going to kill him for me? Come on, Jeremy, things like this. And according to her testimony, she said, "Oh, it was just talk. I really didn't mean for it to happen." But other people overheard these things, and they didn't believe it either. They thought it was, just talk. But there was a real key piece of evidence that, when the police showed up, if we can just explain what happened, there was it was April. It was an April night in 2006, and JR had been, they'd been talking about this plan and how would we do it, and if we did kill them, how would we do it? And they talked about stabbing or drowning or poisoning them or setting the house on fire and all this kind of stuff. And it all came to a head, on this April night. Jeremy was, JR was grounded. Jeremy had gone to a punk show and with some friends of his, and they were all drinking at his mom's trailer, and they drank all of his booze, and then they went into the refrigerator and drank all her booze and smoked some pot and on and on and on. And then Jeremy was watching the movie Natural Born Killers. He thought it was the best love story of all time.
Wow.
That somebody would do some, and he in that movie, it's a girl who's in an abusive, her mom and her dad especially is bad to her and that sort of thing, and and so he decides I'm going to rescue her, and he ends up killing the family, and they go off and they go on a killing spree. And he had written an email saying, "Yeah, well, Jay and I have been talking about, we're going to do it this weekend, and it's going to be just like Natural Born Killers, and we're going to start a killing spree across Canada," right? Well, they all say it was just talk. Really didn't mean for it to happen. But JR is grounded. Jeremy's in his mom's trailer, is drinking. They're brooding about the whole situation. This has been going on for a couple months now, and they're being kept apart, and they're sneaking out, trying to see each other. She had stuck out of the house very cleverly one time. They had sex, and things had gotten to a head. And he was watching this movie, Natural Born Killers, with some friends. And there was a point in the movie where he said to one of the witnesses who testified, the point in the movie where the family is killed and they spare the little brother. And he said, well, that's where it's going to be different, because JR is going to kill her little brother. Well, and that, in fact, ended up happening. Now, if that wasn't discussed, planned in advance, why would he have said that?
Sure.
Her brother was an 8-year-old boy. His name was Jacob. He was into Star Wars, and he thought he was a little Jedi Knight, and he was a typical little 8-year-old boy. And Jeremy is watching the movie. His friends are there. People start to disperse. He gets a call from JR, and we don't know what was said in that conversation because people in the other room only heard bits and pieces. But after he gets the call, he leaves and he goes out into the night, and he And he had asked friends, a couple of friends, will you help me with this? Because he didn't think he could do it himself. He asked a former roommate of his, and he asked a friend of his, and they both said, you're crazy, man. You're insane, and what are you doing running around with a 12-year-old girl, and get your act together and all this kind of stuff. But
he told them he was going to murder the whole family.
Well, they were going to murder. They were talking, at that time, the mom and dad. And, he said, will you help me with it? We're going to kill them. I can't remember if they, I had mentioned the little brother as well. But all his friends told him, no, you're absolutely nuts. So, I'm not going to do that. But they never went to the police. They always thought, oh, it's Jeremy. He's just being crazy, And so he gets this call from JR. Whatever is said that night sets things into motion. And he heads out into the night in this April evening. It's kind of drizzling. He goes over to a friend's house, does a lot of cocaine, and he had been drinking all day long, and they had drank, beer and booze and smoked a lot of pot, and then he goes over to this other guy's place who was a small-time coke dealer and a user, and he goes over to his place and they drink coke, and then they drink wine, and he had asked this guy, he says, how do you clean blood off of knives? No, stuff like that, and they, people were half stoned, didn't know what's going on. Jeremy leaves that place. It's about now 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. He is higher than a kite. He goes over to a local all-night grocery store. He buys some gum because JR didn't like him smoking cigarettes and smoking pot, and she could smell it on his breath. So he buys some gum. And then he goes over to the house, and he's got his hoodie on, he's got his black neoprene mask, he's got the fishnet arm stockings, and he had a knife. He said he always carried a knife for protection because he was bullied as a little kid. And all of his friends sort of carried knives. It was part of the accoutrements of their scene, right? So he throws a pebble at her window. She motions for him to come around to the back. He goes around to the back window, goes in, and her mom hears this noise, and she comes downstairs. And according to the testimony, Jeremy, he insists that he didn't go into the house that night to kill anybody. He just wanted to scare them, take her out of there. They would run away, go to their castle in Germany. He says he sees her mom come down into the basement. It was a 4-level split. She comes down, she hears this noise, and he says, I just freaked, and he started stabbing her. Well, you can imagine with the mom seeing this guy in a black hoodie and a black neoprene mask, dark eyeliners. He would have been a ferocious sight. And Jerry was high on cocaine, he was high on booze, he was high on pot, and he just started stabbing and stabbing and stabbing. And then the dad came down, heard this, and there was a ferocious fight between him and Mark. And I can't. He had Deborah had 12 stab wounds. Mark had 24 stab wounds. Right. There was blood all over the basement. It was just an awful, awful scene. And after he finished, he walked upstairs, dragging his bloody sleeves, bloody clothes. There's blood streaks on the walls when the police came in. And he goes upstairs, and that's where it gets murky. JR is doing something to her little brother. The testimony is conflicting. Jeremy insists that JR was stabbing her little brother. She insists that she admits that she stabbed her little brother once, but not very hard, quote unquote, and that Jeremy was the one who goaded her into doing it. And then she claims that Jeremy finished him off. After the murders, Jeremy goes downstairs. He's pacing wildly back and forth in the house. Says, I got to get out of here. He's paranoid. He's on pot. He's on coke. And JR says, well, just wait a minute. I got to collect a few things. So she nonchalantly goes upstairs, starts getting a few things together, does some cleanup. Jeremy can't stand it. He bolts out of the house, runs into his car, drives away, vomits on the side of the road, drives over to his back to his mom's trailer. His mom's not there. She's never there. She's out on a bender. Jarrett comes down. There's no Jeremy. He's abandoned her, and so she calls she says, "Where are you?" And he says, "Get over here, right away," and that sort of thing. And so she calls a cab, books the cab for, come pick me up in 30 minutes. Takes her mom's bank card, goes to the little 7-Eleven grocery store, all-night store, takes some money out of her mom's account, comes back, gets in the cab, goes to Jeremy. So in court, you can imagine how this played out. Well, geez, you didn't have a plan, but you went back to the man who just butchered your mom and dad, and what were you doing? Well,
what else did they do as well? I mean, it gets a little worse than that. I mean, they didn't just get together and then try to cover up their tracks. Tell us what they did. That insult to injury after the.
Well, so they go over. She goes over to Jeremy's trailer, and they have post-murder sex. This is not uncommon for teen killers. It happens.
Sure.
And then they decide to they go back to the place where Jeremy had done the cocaine a few hours earlier. They grabbed a little bit of sleep, but then they decide that they're going to go to a party. Jeremy has a black eye from the fight with her dad. He's got a pair of dark sunglasses on. They go to this party with Jeremy's buddies. The place is just a party house, an animal house. It's just a pigsty. I drove by the place a couple of times. It's a fourplex. And there's an old chair that's been thrown off the balcony, and there's broken beer bottles all over. And they go to this party, and everybody's drinking. And at the party, which is less than a mile from the house where the murders were committed, I mean, they were either so brazen or so stupid that they have this. They go to this party. They're cuddling on the couch. They're making out. People testified that in fact, there was one girl, a young woman, teenager. She had a child. She was a single mom. She had gone back to that place that day. She wanted to. It was her the father of her child that sort of owned the place. He was a notorious drunk and alcoholic. Had been in jail the night before. She was actually put off by they were groping each other on the couch, that she had to leave the room, right? And they didn't know that any murders had gone on, but Jeremy had this black eye, and he kept lifting his dark glasses and showing his friends his big shiner. It was a badge of courage. And finally, he told one of his best friends what had happened. And he said, well, we did it. And he said, you did what? And he said, we gutted them like fish. And the guy said, you guys are crazy. I'm getting out of here, right? And he left. And
what did they say about the little brother? Then they added something about the little brother.
Oh yes. And they were down in a bedroom, and everybody was drinking. This party was going on, and Jeremy says to his friend, he says, we gutted them like fish. And JR, without any prompting, says, yeah, my little brother gargled because his throat had been cut.
Right.
And the guy said, you guys are crazy. I'm getting out of here. And I didn't even know if he even believed them at that time. So anyway, eventually the party winds down, and now it's starting to get evening. The bodies were discovered at about 1:30 in the afternoon. By now it's all over, it's starting to break on the news and everything like that, and they're starting to get nervous. And JR and Jeremy are then spirited out of town by another friend of Jeremy's, and they drive to a little town called Leader, Saskatchewan. They spend the night shivering in the car. It's cold. It's the Canadian prairie. It's springtime. They were low on gas. They were in this truck. JR and Jeremy slept in the back of the truck. 3 other girls were in the front. They were all huddling and cold. And in the morning, they didn't have any gas. All the gas stations were closed, so they park in just outside of town, and then when the sun starts coming up, they turn on the car and they drive to a gas station, and there was a very smart young rookie RCMP officer who had the all points bulletin that some people in a car, in this vehicle, they had a description, might be coming to his community. And the reason they knew this, because all these kids who had been at this party and knew Jeremy and knew of all this talk, all of a sudden see on the news that these murders had happened. And to their credit, they came forward to the police, and they were disturbed by it. They were shocked. All of a sudden they realized it wasn't just talk. My God, it really happened. So they had a description of the vehicle. They had gone to the school, to find out. Oh, the real interesting thing is when the cops showed up at the house, they find the bodies, the mom, the dad, the little brother, but there's a picture of a family sitting on the coffee table, and there's a girl in the picture, and she's missing. And they think, my God, where is she? We missed a body. We look. They can't find her. And they think, well, where is she? They think it's going to be horrible if she comes home and sees this mess. We have to find this girl. And they found out that she was a member of a swim team. Maybe she was away on a swim meet. They go to the school to try and find lists of her friends so they can start calling, because they were under the impression that she had been abducted maybe, or was away. They weren't sure what was going on. They go into her locker and find a very disturbing drawing that she had made, of stick drawing, a 10-panel cartoon of a family being burned alive. And there was a mom, a dad, a little boy, a little figure, stick figure, and then there was another stick figure off to the side laughing, and then running off with another stick figure. In the distance there was this crudely drawn truck, and it was labeled Jeremy's truck. And the police officer saw this and went, oh my God. And on the flip side of it was a poem that she had written, and it was, may you burn in the eternal flames of hell, or something like that. And he knew right away, she's not an innocent she hasn't been abducted. This implicates her in the murder. Boom, and the chase is on. And so this RCMP officer in this little town called Leader, Saskatchewan, gets the information that this truck may, and on a hunch he thinks, well, I wonder if they're going to need gas. And so he drives around all night, not doesn't see anything, so he goes home, gets a couple hours sleep, and then he comes back in his own vehicle and decides to park by the gas station. And lo and behold, boom, the vehicle pulls up, Alberta license plates. 3 girls get out of the front, walk in, and he goes, and they're matching the description. They drive away. He calls for backup. They pull into the schoolyard. They don't know where they're going, what they're going to do, and they had gone into the store, and they saw this picture of the house on the front page of the Medicine Hat News, with forensics investigators bringing bodies out of the house. And JR and Jeremy, were reading the paper, and pointing at it and pointing out errors in the story and all that kind of stuff. And still their friends believed them that they didn't do it, that for some reason. And then one of them finally twigged and said, we got to get you guys out of here. They think you're guilty. We got to get you out. So they drive away. This cop is following them. They call for backup. They pull over into the schoolyard. The police surround the vehicle, get the 3 girls out of the front. They open up the back, and there's JR and Jeremy in the back, and the gig was up. They were arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder.
Now, we don't have very much time. We've just got about a minute here. Right. So basically, I just want to tell people that the trial is a very fascinating part of your book as well. This is, I got to commend you on a great book. It's a great story to start off with, but you've really written this really well, and I suggest anybody that's listened to this interview to pick up this book, Runaway Devil, Robert Remington, Sherry Zickfus. A great story and very well written. I think you're going to have a lot of success with this book, because it's just a fascinating story, and you really draw everybody in. So
I want to thank you for agreeing to this interview too, Robert. So
I thank you very much. And kind of one of the scary things about this is that she's going to be out of jail in a little over a year, and because she was, a young offender, so they were restricted as to how much time they could give her, and she's going to be back out in the community in no time.
Well, another scary thing too is how long will he be in jail in Canada with Canadian laws? I mean,
he'll be in for a minimum of 25 years.
Yeah, so he'll still be a young man.
He'll be 48, I believe, around there. 47, 40. He'll be under 50 by the time he gets out.
Yeah, just an incredible
story.
Well,
that's a minimum. I mean, he could get more, but who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Well, let's hope so anyway.
Yeah.
Let's hope so. But thanks very much. You've done a great service with writing a great book and letting people know. I knew a little bit about this story, but there's just no way that I'm really glad I got a chance to read this. It's a great book.
Yeah. Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
Okay, thank you. So have yourself a good evening, Robert.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, with your host, Dan Zupansky. Have yourself a good evening. Good night.